Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first Local Talks event of the year. My name is Randy Karangizi, and I'll be hosting this session today. I just have to let you know before we start that we are recording this Zoom webinar, and we are also live streaming on Facebook. So if you hear of anyone that can't join, as Zoom cuts at the first 100 participants, please direct them to Facebook, or you can also use the Facebook as well, our Facebook LocalWorks Facebook account. So Local Talks is a series of events that bring people together who are interested in different topics around green design and construction in East Africa predominantly. It started last year, and we had 3 events that were run last year. The original intention was to have these events on site and to engage with people in person, but due to COVID, we took to webinars and Zoom for some of the events. So we're really happy for all of you to be joining us today in this webinar, and we are thankful for our 2 speakers that will be introduced to you. The topic today is tropical roofs, and our title is Tropical Roofs, Sunshade, Rain Collector, Powerplant, and more. So we'd also like to thank the USA, the Uganda Society of Architects, for supporting this event and our previous events. And thank you to the speakers for joining us and sharing their presentations with us. And I think that's everything from me. If you have any questions during the presentations, please feel free to type them out, or I can also unmute you and you can share your question live. Felix Holland, a director at Local Talks, is now going to share a little bit about the topic and the speakers that are going to present this evening. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you will enjoy this webinar session.
Thank you, Randy, and good evening, everybody. As Randy said, my name is Felix Holland. I'm an architect with Local Works, and it is my role maybe just to say a few words this evening as to why we chose the topic of today, tropical roofs. It is really it's a topic that is very close to my heart, and that I come across in my daily life, and I felt it is worth thinking a bit more about it. If you think of the facade of a building for a moment as a face, with maybe the windows being the eyes and the parapet being the forehead, then probably you would think of the roof as maybe the hat of the building, or indeed the hairstyle. And if you've ever witnessed maybe a person with very long hair going to the hairdresser and having it all cut off, then you know to what extent the hairstyle really influences the appearance of a person, and even how we perceive the personality of someone. You really you will probably feel at that moment that a completely different person stands in front of you. And if we look maybe a good 100 years back or so to the beginning of the modernist era, there is no denying that many of the new paradigms that were formed at the time, all the innovations that were brought about, all the conventions that were thrown away or done away with, all of those have influenced what we do up to now in a very strong way. One of the things that modernism really did away with in many ways is the roof. It was the triumph of the flat roof. Back to the hairstyle analogy, one could probably say that we are now surrounded by lots of bald heads competing for attention without relying on the mastery of hairdressers. Now, the interesting thing is that the place many of us that I see on the list of attendees are working in is tropical. And tropical environments are not particularly suitable to flat roofs. We have huge amounts of rain in very short time periods. We have a very harsh sun for long hours, lots of UV radiation. And the reality is really that most waterproofing that is being installed on flat roofs doesn't last much longer than 10 years. So really, the problem that we face as architects in tropical locations, or working in tropical locations, is that we can't really do away with the roof. And this is what we want to speak about tonight. Our teachers, the grandchildren of the modernists, haven't really taught us how to design roofs. The sort of overriding theme for this evening will therefore be, the roof is a necessity, and we need to learn how to embrace it rather than trying to negate it. We need to master the design of it. We are going to look at the roof and the roof in tropical locations from two completely different angles tonight. We've done that in the previous session when we were talking about straw in quite an interesting way with two presenters who have their unique angle on this issue. The second part of this evening will be a presentation by Daniel Propst, who is an engineer and the research and development manager at EMI here in Uganda. Daniel is actually currently in the States and will present from there, but he was himself, together with a group of colleagues, involved in a very interesting study about the roofing material that most of us use most, and that is the corrugated metal sheet roof. He has done many interesting experiments and will share those with you, including simple questions about what difference does the color, the finish of the roof sheet actually make? How does radiation heat manifest itself? And what can we learn from that towards making more comfortable buildings or creating more comfortable indoor climates? The first part of this evening is a presentation that will be much more architectural in its nature. We will look at different roof typologies that are suitable for tropical locations, and I think we will discuss the question to what extent the modern contemporary architecture is possible without negating the needs of the tropical climate. I think that is sort of the main question. For that, we have Dr. Antoni Folkers with us, who is a co-founder of FBW and who is an eminent design architect with decades of experience designing in Africa, designing buildings for Africa, but who is also a researcher and a publisher of this very interesting book that I recommend to all of you. Show it here. Antoni hopefully will say a few words about this book and how people can get a chance to read it. Those of you who are in Kampala are always welcome to come and see it here in our office. With those few words, I would like to invite Antoni to start his presentation, and then before we hand over to Daniel, and then at the end, we are all looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much and enjoy the talk.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Felix, for the glowing introduction. To set something right is this hairstyle thing that was very much perturbed by COVID here in Europe, as all the saloons were closed, and I had to use a whole pot of wax to put it into some shape to confront you, because it's just I wouldn't look good otherwise. The other thing about the book that Felix just showed before I go into my talk, I wrote that in 2010, and it was republished 2 years ago, and I repaired a mistake in the second edition by adding my partner Belinda van Buiten to the as co-author, because without her input and without her work, I would have never been able to even think about that book. So there is a second edition available on Springer for some horrendous amount, but there are other ways also to access the texts. And this I should not be saying if Springer is listening, but I still have a stack of the old edition, and I'm happy to share with people who are really interested. So let me now start my talk, and hopefully this time I don't mess up with technology. Just to be sure, Felix, Randy, is this correct?
Yes, yep, we can see it.
Okay, and let me go to full screen now. Good. Okay, so I need to be a bit succinct, a bit short in my talk, not to bore you, and also to keep time. Randy will let me know if I become too talkative. So going back to the haircut and to the hat and everything. So do we really need a roof when we are building in Africa? This is of course an image that we're not really supposed to show anymore. I do it nonetheless. But what it does prove us is that much of the life in the African household and in the African town and city took place outdoors. And I'm quoting here George Sendiwala, our Kampala colleague, who says, you know, that contrary to what we Europeans say, my home is my castle, my home is a place to sleep, and then he adds some other lines that I am not quoting further, but it just gives you an indication of the importance, of the not so big importance of the roof, up to you to decide. This way of constructing a home or a house or a roof, you can see here clearly in the city of Ouagadougou, which was a sizable city right already in the late 19th century. And on this survey done in 1984, you can see how the city was growing and developing, and still based on the traditional compound typology. So all the compounds are shown here with a lot of open space, and only the red dots are the roofs of the small huts or the small cabins around this open area where people used to live. Now, if you look at the same area in now, this is just taken right now from Google Earth. This is exactly the same area, and what you see is that most of the area is now covered by roofs. So obviously the lifestyle of the citizen of Ouagadougou has evolved into a far more indoor living culture. So we need a roof. That's basically what is the conclusion from this in contemporary Africa. It has gained in importance and in volume. And like what Felix just introduced, you know, what form of roof do you choose for, or no roof whatsoever, or an how you call it, a negation of the existence of the roof, which was a modernist paradigm. And roof form in traditional Africa was very much guided by climatic conditions and by the availability of materials and technology. So if you go to maybe the three main forms of a roof, a vaulted roof, a hipped roof, and a flat roof, you will find the vaulted roof in the desert zone and then constructed with only mineral materials and hardly any availability of organic materials, which more or less forces you to go into a vaulted construction, which has the added advantage of accumulating heat during the day and radiating it off during the cold night. This was a big inspiration for myself as designer when I started, in particular through the book and the project by Hassan Fatih in New Guinea in the 1940s. So reintroducing parabolic dome vaults and dome structures in this in the rebuilding of that village in southern Egypt. The opposite is the humid zone, the hot humid zone, where roofs are to be steep and pitched to make sure that you get rid of the water, and where the availability of materials is often the opposite to the desert conditions, that you have mainly organic materials. So you get a thatched roof under a lightweight wood structure that also has the big advantage of giving you optimal solutions, optimal chances to create ventilation and make sure that you get rid of the water as soon as you can. Well, there's an example of a settlement in Benin, taken in the 1970s, which explicitly gives this typology. Then the third type is the flat roof that we do find in traditional architecture in Africa, and in particular in the in-between zones in the Sahel area and in the savannah, but also in places like Morocco, where we find roofs made of mixed materials, both organic and mineral materials, and where the roof also get a bit more function as a roof terrace to sleep on during hot nights, or in inland Tanzania, in the Doma area, where roofs are used for storing crops. And here you see this beautiful traditional architecture of the Gogo in Tanzania. So it's not that the flat roof was ignored, that it ignored the roof. It was conspicuous, but it was definitely existing. So what did that mean for myself as a designing architect? Well, this is my very first building in that I was allowed to design and to build in Burkina in 1984. And as you can see, I was seriously inspired by Hassan Fatih and firmly believed in reviving domed and vaulted architecture. And in this project, we were I was asked to build an office for a redevelopment of a large area, to inform people, but also to give an example of how they could build their own homes. But I can admit, and unfortunately, it was not a success. The building was a fantastic experience, but it was not adopted by the local population as a model for their homes. So I learned a bit fast and turned soon to a rather conventional roof type that you find throughout Africa, and in particular when I started working in Tanzania in the late 1980s, became a bit more pragmatic and adopted the steel sheet roof, and discovered and realized that for public buildings like hospitals and schools, where budgets are always very limited, it's I think your obligation as an architect to provide the most secure roof possible. So do not save on cost for erecting a roof, but make sure that it will last for a long time and protect the building against sun impact and rain. Now, this building that you see here in particular had some additional challenges because there was hardly any power, and for the operation theater, it was meant to have a roof light. Now, a roof light in a hot area like Tanzania lowlands is really a challenge, but we managed by using this triple layered polycarbonate glazing, which has a very low factor of letting heat through and yet providing light. But it's an expensive material, and you need really multiple layers to allow the light to get through and not to heat up the space. But in essence, on most of our projects, we adopted this pragmatic roof, ventilated roof, double roof, and big overhangs, and preferably also a jack roof on top to act as a chimney. Not only on projects with a tight budget, but also on more generous budget projects like villas. We use the same typology, and like the house here in northern Tanzania on the slopes of Mount Meru, which has a far more clement climate, but still has high rainfall and issues with high sun impact during certain moments of the day, and the client didn't want to spend any money on air conditioning. The other type of pitched roof is the roofs that you see all around when it comes to tourist accommodation. And funny enough, also when you go to any African city, the bars in the cities, they still carry, they're still having thatch roofs, which is, I find it very heartwarming always, whether you're in South Africa or in Uganda or in Senegal and you go to a bar, you have a fair chance to have a thatch roof over it, even if it's in the middle of a metropolis. So there, the reintroduction of these fantastic materials like thatch and makuti, the palm leaf roofs, are being reintroduced. They have fantastic qualities in terms of protection against sun, and also of course the aesthetic quality is very high. But you have to make a steep roof, a very steep roof, otherwise you keep on replacing your thatch every 2 or 3 years. Now, a flat roof is something that has been, I think, well, Felix is talking about being a grandchild of the modernist generation, not himself maybe, but a lot of our audience will be. But I still count myself as one of the, maybe one of the last modernists around. And I've been taught at Delft, and Delft is sometimes referred to as the Cuba of modernism. Where they were very strict in teaching, and our professors, they taught us to design these buildings in the whole paradigm and the whole principles of good old Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and you name them. So we are still somehow stuck to this flat roof, and here in a proposal for a hotel in the Nyerere National Park, the former Salou Game Reserve, we suggested to convert an old research camp. So it's existing buildings with hipped roofs, to conceal those hipped roofs under a thick pack of twigs and branches, inspired, of course, by the beautiful Dogon architecture. And well, I still think it might be a way of, of not only enhancing the aesthetical qualities of the building, but also to protect the building against overheating. But maintenance issues will be serious with this building, which is not really a problem when you work on hotels and luxury residences. But of course, it's not something that you would easily propose for a hospital or a school. And then last but not least, and this is one of the latest projects that I've been involved in, this typical, I think, well, very much influenced by my modernist background and my modernist teachers, and but there is a roof, and the roof is a hipped roof, but it's inverted, and it's over a big collecting gutter for water, and it's covered with photovoltaic panels, and yet you don't see them. So it's a bit of a trick we played to achieve a modernist outlook with a double skin building, as you can see, with screen blocks to protect the inner facades, and a double roof where the inverted roof is just as a regular Mabati steel sheet roof. And well, that brings me to the last part of my presentation, and that's about what materials do we have to cover our roofs with. Well, concrete is of course the choice that was preferred by modernist architects, but like Felix said, it has a lot of disadvantages to prevent it against leaking, but also as accumulating heat in most of East African's climate is not really the best one, apart from its expenses. Asbestos is a material you might not even know anymore, but I can tell you that when I was starting my work in East Africa, it was one of the most popular roofing materials. And it was thought like, the panacea of the roof challenges in the tropics, because it had this more or less the same performance as steel sheets, but it was a much better insulator than steel sheets, before we found out that it was highly dangerous for our health, and that we had to replace them all. Then ceramic and concrete tiles are good alternatives, but they require substantial substructure in wood or steel, making it again a rather expensive solution. Thatch or makuti organic materials are of course very beautiful and climate responsive, and also sustainable in the sense of recycling and having little impact on the environment, but are becoming quite expensive and is highly dangerous in a city context because of fire. Now, plastic sheeting we see also sometimes being applied, but I don't think most of the plastics are resistant to the tropical sun. And from what I've seen and what I've been applying in some of the buildings on the client's request, they didn't last long, apart from this very expensive polycarbonate multi-layered glazing for this exceptional project in Turiani. Well, there's maybe some more I could talk about, but for me, in the end, we are talking about corrugated iron, corrugated aluminium roof sheets as being favorites, and they are my favorites. And maybe I'm preempting the next talk, but I see there the future for at least the contemporary and the near future challenges in Africa. The sheets are the shorter sheets, the 3 meter or the 270 meter sheets, they are produced can be produced by very simple equipment from a coil. You can transport them very easily, as you see here. They are not, and they are, they are to be found everywhere. As you can see here in the redevelopment of Zanzibar Nambo, this the other side of Stone Town Zanzibar in the 1960s and 70s, you can see here that people dismantling their old houses. You can see the new apartment blocks being built. But in dismantling their houses, what do they take with them? They take the mabati with them because they can be perfectly recycled and therefore have a very, very long life. It's a material somehow. It's a sheet somehow that wasn't popular when I started building and designing in Africa amongst the architectural profession, and people were saying, yeah, it's hot, it's ugly, it's not African. But I can hardly see any roofing material being more African than the standard mabati sheet nowadays. Of course, it's not only having advantages. This is an aerial shot of a part of Dar es Salaam, and you see this sea of tin roofs, which is actually not, I think, as an image, is not directly unattractive, but it has some serious disadvantages. And one is that it has been measured recently that in this particular area of Dar es Salaam, the ambient temperature can be up to 13 degrees centigrade higher than if it were a natural green cover area. So it doesn't really add well to the to the city in terms of its climate, and of course also not for the interior of these buildings, which are often not having proper double layered roofs, ventilated roofs. Apart from disadvantages being fairly easy to burglar, to break in, and quite noisy when it's raining or a mango falls on the roof. Then I'm getting to the end of my story. Is that I think the steel sheets has some further characteristics that could be developed further, and one of them is that if you bend them, they are actually very strong, and you can go into roofs that are not really having a need of a ridge, like you see here in a building in Kampala that we designed in the late 90s, Motorcare, where we could reduce on truss strength and create this fan light by bending the sheets. And I end my presentation with a sketch that I recently found when I was dreaming about even creating a tin sheet roof without any support. I don't know what's of this, but I was thinking if you can go to maybe a 3.5 or 4 meter span roof, you can do that without the need of any truss or substructure because of the inherent strength of the mabati sheet, so that it could become really a model for even less expensive buildings and being one possible solution for social housing. But as you can see, this was in 1989, and I never managed to find time or energy to develop it. But it's something that, again, I think this corrugated iron sheet or corrugated aluminium sheets has a lot of possibilities to be developed further. And this is where I close my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was Dr. Antoni Folkers. Thank you for sharing your talk with us. If anyone has questions, please feel free to continue to ask us in the question and answer box, or as I said earlier, I will also allow these questions to be for you. I will unmute you and you can ask these questions live after the next talk. So now we will have Daniel Propst sharing his presentation with us. So I can hand over to him.
All right. Yeah, I've really enjoyed these local talks in the past. So thank you all for putting these on. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been looking at and the things that we've been learning. Yeah, very interesting, Dr. Antoni. Yeah, I think there's a lot of correlations of what you've been learning over the years and some of the things that we're looking at as well. Let me try to share my screen here. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. All right. So yeah, as Felix and Dr. Antoni mentioned, metal roofs are often used with EMI. That's primarily what we use. But one of the downsides is they can make the building quite hot. And so we've spent quite a bit of time testing and trying to understand how we can best block the heat from getting into a building to try to keep the indoor environment more comfortable. And my presentation, as Felix mentioned, is going to be a lot different. I'm going to be showing you a lot of graphs and numbers. I'm an engineer, not an architect. So basically we're trying to gather the data to try to understand what characteristics have what impact. And so I'm going to go a little deep into the weeds here at the beginning. I realize this is probably not something everyone is interested in, but I think it's important to try to understand the physics, I guess, of what's going on, because otherwise it's very easy to try to implement some of these strategies, but do them in a wrong way that would actually make things worse and put a lot of money without the results. So I think it's important to try to understand what is going on. And I realize it's very difficult to try to do that in 20 minutes, but hopefully it can at least introduce some ideas to you. I've, in spending months on this, it's been a process even in my own mind to get this straight. But hopefully if you can, if the ideas are introduced, you can do some further research. Certainly we'd love to share more, but I'll try to go through it quickly here in 20 minutes. So if you remember back to your science or physics classes, there's three different ways that heat is transferred: conduction, convection, and radiation. So I'm in North America right now, a very cold place. And in North America, or generally in cold weather climates, conduction and convection are the main, or trying to block heat from moving through conduction or convection are the main approaches. So right now, for instance, outside, it's probably below freezing, and obviously in my house, I want it to be warmer. So the walls are thicker, they have insulation, same with the roof. All the little cracks around the doors and windows are plugged up so that we don't get drafts coming in. So yeah, those are the main ways of trying to reduce heat transfer. I guess maybe I should just back up real quick. Conduction, that's just heat transfer from a solid through a solid substance. So if you have a piece of metal in a fire and you grab it and it burns your hand, that heat is being conducted through the metal piece and a solid piece, right? Convection is heat transfer through liquid or a gas, so air or a fluid. And then radiation is one that we don't think about much, but what we found is that this is the most important one in a tropical climate. So in the tropics, we design buildings completely opposite of how things are done in cold weather climates. In the tropics, the weather is generally, at least like in Uganda, central region, the weather's very nice, pretty much all year round. And we don't use mechanical systems, air conditioning, heating much. And so buildings are built opposite of what they are, say, here than here where I am in the US. They're made to be as open as possible, trying to get the outside air into the building, as much ventilation as possible. So the main source we've seen of a building heating up is through the roof, and the roof is getting heated up by the sun, obviously. And that type of heat transfer is radiation. Radiation is energy moving through the electromagnetic spectrum, so by light, basically. So as an example, one client came to us and their library was extremely hot. No one wanted to stay in the library and study. And when we went in and took some measurements, so the graph on the left, we put a sensor outside in the shade of a tree, and we put another sensor inside the library. And sure enough, we could measure that the temperature of the sensor inside the library was, 5 to 7 degrees C above the outside temperature. And not only that, it was heating up the floor, it was heating up the walls. So you had all these hot surfaces around, and it was very uncomfortable. Once I was in there for a while, I noticed I just started sweating. But what was interesting about it was at the same time, we put a sensor inside a box with radiant barriers around it, and we ran a fan moving the air that was inside the library through the box, and we just measured the air temperature. And what we found is that the air temperature was not very hot. It was, as you can see on the graph on the right, the air temperature was probably within 1 degree of the air temperature outside under the tree during the hot parts of the day. And so what that shows us is that they didn't really have a big ventilation problem. That's kind of what they thought, and they were thinking maybe they would have to knock out their windows and put bigger windows in. And but what this shows, and we've seen this often, is that it's generally not a ventilation issue. The air, we don't have a hot air problem. It's what's happening is there's this radiant heat that's coming from the roof, and that doesn't necessarily heat the air right away. It heats the objects in a room. So when I'm in there, it's heating my body, it's heating the tables, those kind of things. So ventilation is really important. That's generally, I think, what we first think about when we want to try to keep a space at a comfortable condition, and it is very important. But especially in the tropics, where we've got this pretty intense sun, that there's more to the story than just ventilation. So if we look at the electromagnetic spectrum of what's coming from the sun, there's a small percentage is the UV spectrum. Then there's the whole visible spectrum. And then there's this about 50% of the energy coming from the sun is not visible to us, but it's in the infrared or IR spectrum. So if we look at a roof or roofing system, so this is a type of system that we've used at EMI quite a bit. We've used the top roofing sheet, and then we'll have a radiant barrier, and then a corrugated roofing sheet as the ceiling. So if we look at what's going on in this situation, the light coming from the sun, there's the UV portion of that. And this is high frequency energy coming. And this doesn't generate a lot of heat, but what it does is it goes in and it breaks down bonds. So like Dr. Antoni said, plastic often deteriorates. Felix had mentioned waterproofing materials. So the UV part of this, even though it's a small percentage, it's very destructive. It goes in, it fades paints, it breaks down. If the polycarbonate doesn't have a UV protection layer on it, it can break down the polycarbonate or in plastics. This is the part that gives us sunburn, or it gives us cancer, skin cancer. The visible spectrum, we know that's made up of these different frequencies, and that's what gives us different colors, right? So if the sunlight's coming and it hits our green roof, the green roof absorbs all of the frequencies except for the green frequency, which it reflects, and that's why we see a green roof, right? And then the IR spectrum, this is a low frequency wave. It generally gets absorbed by most things, and most of the energy is converted to heat. So if we look at the top sheet, again, about half the energy is in the visible spectrum, and about half of it is in the IR spectrum. And so on the top sheet, the frequencies that are absorbed in the visible spectrum are generally converted to heat, and then pretty much all of the IR spectrum is absorbed by heat. So this is, any object, you sitting in the room, your table, your computer, everything emits energy proportional to their temperature, and the temperature has a big factor of how much energy or heat any object emits, and it emits it to the temperature to the 4th power, as you can see there in the equation. And so as that roofing sheet gets hot, it's going to emit more energy generally that gets absorbed as heat. When we're talking here, again, this is all when the top sheet is absorbing all this energy from the sun, and then it's re-emitting it, and it's re-emitting it all in the IR spectrum. So it's not something that we can see, obviously. So what we want to, when we want to block that IR energy, we have to have some type of shield or block that works to block the IR spectrum, not necessarily the visible spectrum. And this kind of introduces some terms. We won't spend a lot of time here, but this idea of reflectivity and emissivity, and these are important terms to understand. But basically, it's how much energy or heat does the surface reflect, and how much does it, on the bottom side, does it re-emit down? And so what we see is if we use materials that have low reflectivity and high emissivity, that a lot of that heat passes right through. So it doesn't reflect much, and it re-emits a lot. Whereas, and so we get a lot of energy radiating down into the room, say. However, if we use materials that have high reflectivity and low emissivity, we can drastically reduce the amount of heat that comes into the room. So you can see the difference there. So what we've done, this is getting, so that's a bit of the background of just kind of what's going on. What we've done is we've set up a test where we can look at 20 different roofing samples. We've got insulated polystyrene boxes, and we can put 20 different types of roofing samples and try to compare them to each other. We're not getting absolute values. We're just looking at how does one type of roof compare to the other. Inside the box, we're measuring 3 different temperatures. We're measuring the temperature of the bottommost roofing layer, so the ceiling piece, the air in the box, and we have a steel plate inside the box, and we're measuring on the bottom side of that. We're seeing how hot does that steel plate get. So we've collected, a lot of data. It's kind of hard to make sense of that. I'm real quick going to just go through all 20 of these. I'm not going to talk about them really, but just to show you kind of the difference in that the type of roof can make. So a transparent sheet, as Dr. Antoni mentioned in the one project in Tanzania, I think the challenge with the clear sheets is that they let in a lot of heat, and we see that in our tests. Black, red, blue, orange, green, white, unpainted aluminum zinc sheets. And then we get into some of the different layers that we tested. All right, so if we look at just color, I do have the gray line there that shows the transparent sheet, and basically I'm just there to show how much additional heat transparent skylights let in. And this is a big challenge because we want to take advantage of natural lighting, but the challenge is all the heat that comes with it, right? So we'll just primarily focus on the other sheets that are more opaque. And this isn't really too surprising. I think this is probably pretty intuitive to most of us. The dark sheets, the darker the sheet, the more heat they absorb, and therefore the more they emit into the box. So again, these boxes are, we've tried to keep them completely contained so there's no ventilation. That's essentially just to try to keep the test uniform between all of the boxes. And so these are the temperatures generally of the plate inside the box. So with the dark plates, or the dark roofing sheets, the black or the red, dark blue, obviously those are going to be higher temperature than, say, the sheets that were painted white or were close to an off-white. At the very bottom of this, so the green line is ambient temperature, the air temperature in the shade of a tree. The bottommost gray line, that's where we used a unpainted aluminum zinc sheet. So that one performed the best, even compared to a white painted roof. And then the other thing that we looked at is different layers within the roofing system. We call this a sandwich panel or sandwich system. So as I showed kind of in one of the first slides, we've used radiant barriers, and we've put those between the top sheet and the corrugated ceiling piece. And we wanted to see how does this impact the heat coming through. So on the top orange line, the one that's the hottest, that's where we used a dark red sheet and no radiant barrier, and then just a painted corrugated ceiling sheet. And so you can see that, I mean, it does reduce the amount of heat coming through, but the rest of these generally have a radiant barrier, and you can see that that radiant barrier really cuts down the heat significantly. The other thing that's interesting to note here is this light blue line. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but there's a light blue line about the fourth one from the top. There's a light blue line, and that's a manufactured product that's quite expensive that we can get in Kampala, and it has 50 millimeters of polystyrene insulation, so it's very thick. And we wanted to see how that product would compare to these radiant barriers that are less than a millimeter thick. And what we found is that we could achieve better results and much less costly with much less costly materials by using very, very thin, less than a millimeter radiant barriers. We could achieve better results than you know, this 2 inches or 50 millimeters of what we typically think of insulation. And I think this just goes to show the difference of what's going on here compared to, you know, like where I am in the US now, we go to very thick insulation, like that polystyrene or closed cell foam, and that works good for this climate. But for the tropical climate, there's better ways that we can reduce the heat than just adopting the insulation techniques that work in cold weather climates. The dynamics are different, as I tried to explain at the beginning. So a couple things that we wanted to understand better. There's different types of radiant barriers, or different types of materials that you can use as a radiant barrier. So the types of material that work good as radiant barriers are highly polished metals. So aluminum is a good radiant barrier. You know, in space, they often maybe use like gold sheets. Obviously, that's very cost prohibitive. It's good for that application, but it's the same principle that's going on there. So we've been able to find, you can find it in various forms, at least in Kampala, this sort of a bubble wrap material, or it's a very thin foam material, maybe 3 to 5 millimeters thick, and then aluminum foil on top and bottom. And that aluminum foil is what's most important. The bubble wrap really doesn't do a whole lot. It looks better, and so it's a better selling material, I think. But when we've done tests, we see basically no gain from having that bubble wrap, versus we used to be able to get just a aluminum, or basically a reinforced aluminum sheet, very thin aluminum sheet, like a tin foil. And when we've run tests against the bubble wrap material, and we see they perform almost exactly the same. And that again is because of the surface properties. Both of them have this high polished aluminum surface, and so that reflects a lot of the incoming energy, and probably more importantly, it's a very low has a very low emissivity value, so it re-radiates a very small percentage of the energy that it absorbs. So the other thing that we looked at, you know, you can get the flat aloe zinc sheets from local roofing manufacturers, like in Uganda, Roofings or Uganda Bati. You can get these very thin 32 gauge flat sheets. So this is often what's used underneath tile roofs. You can also see people forming concrete columns with this flat aloe zinc sheets. And we wanted to see how would this perform compared to these more expensive imported radiant barriers. And the data was a little bit, depending on the day, could vary a bit, but basically it seems that it performs almost as good, maybe not quite. And that makes sense. The other materials are, you know, 100% aluminum outer surface. This is a mix of aluminum and zinc, but it performed quite well, and it's substantially less expensive than the imported radiant barriers. So that's been helpful to us, and something that we're using now as radiant barriers. The other thing we wanted to understand is does the surface properties of the ceilings, does that have an impact on the amount of heat that comes into the building? Obviously, there's other considerations, how things look and all of that, but just strictly from a performance standpoint of trying to block heat, if we used an unpainted aluminum zinc ceiling, does that perform better than a painted ceiling piece? Again, this doesn't really matter. This doesn't really the color doesn't really matter. It's just the surface properties. So the paint, the properties of the paint versus the properties of the aluminum zinc sheet. And what we found is that the unpainted ceiling did reduce the amount of heat that was that came into our test box. So on the top, the red and the orange, the red, that's with a painted ceiling. The top layers are all the same, and the orange is with the unpainted ceiling. Again, the top layers are the same as the one above. So, and even if we looked at a unpainted top roofing sheet, again with a painted ceiling versus unpainted ceiling, we saw some advantage there with a unpainted ceiling. The other thing we wanted to look at is the placement of the radiant barrier, and essentially we found that if we could keep a bit of an air gap, maybe 20 mil air gap above and below the radiant barrier, we saw that perform better than if the radiant barrier was right up against the top roofing sheet. That poses some construction challenges, but just strictly from a research standpoint, it's helpful to understand what properties and what the placement of material, what impact that has. So if we can get the radiant barrier with a bit of a air gap, doesn't have to be much, either side, it allows the radiant barrier to function well, and it ends up blocking quite a bit of the heat coming into the box. So this is just basically a summary. Translucent sheets, skylights, they let in a lot of heat. Obviously let in light, which is nice. Single sheets that are dark colors bring in quite a bit of heat as well. Single sheets that are more medium color, and single sheets that are light colored, unpainted aluminum zinc sheets perform the best as far as just a single layer. If we add additional layers, we get more benefit, or reduce the amount of heat. And the best case that we saw, we could, if we have a radiant barrier that's air gap both sides, and then we have a ceiling that is unpainted, so it has this low emissivity value, we could keep our completely insulated boxes within a few degrees of ambient temperatures while the box is sitting right out in the sun. So that was quite striking to see that we could basically reduce almost 100% of the radiant heat coming into these boxes by using very thin, strategically placed metal sheets. We could basically block that energy coming into our box. So this is just that library that I talked about at the very beginning. They were thinking about knocking out their windows and trying to get more ventilation, but when they added a relatively low cost radiant barrier, when we measured in the library again, we could see that their peak temperatures were basically right in line with outside ambient air conditions. So the same temperature as the air in the shade of a tree nearby. This is something that we've looked at in our office. We had a lot of heat issues, and we ended up adding a radiant barrier to the center portion. We've also used this, what you ended up with, Dr. Antoni, with the curved metal sheet. That's what we've used in our office. That's worked quite well, but it did generate a lot of heat. And when we added a radiant barrier and a second roofing sheet on the center section, we reduced the amount of heat substantially. So this is a infrared image. The blue is the center sheet center section that we modified, and the red is kind of these wing areas that that we didn't do any modification. And so you can see on the IR image, there's quite a substantial difference. I think the actual temperature differences were probably about, I think almost close to 30°C difference. Here's just a few pictures of buildings and projects where we've taken this research and we've applied it. So these buildings we've used the unpainted aloe zinc sheets. The bottom left is a workshop. We've used the unpainted aloe zinc sheets on the top as well as on the walls. The middle and the bottom right are some examples of using the corrugated sheets as the ceiling and part of that sandwich roofing system. One project we're working on now where we're using this, what we found out directly. We've got a client that wants to retrofit a 40-foot shipping container, and they want to put this right out, in the sun. And because they're wanting to do some audio and video recording, they don't want any noise coming in from outside. So even opening up windows is not an option. They want all the windows closed, and then power is not reliable at all. So running even a fan is not really an option, much less air conditioning. And so we've been trying to figure out how do we keep this metal box that's sitting out in the tropical sun, how do we keep this at a comfortable temperature? And so we've applied what we've seen in these tests. We're putting multiple layers of this very thin radiant barrier. In this case we're using this 32 gauge metal sheeting, flat sheets. So you can see on the top right where we've put a layer of that all around the container. In the middle top, it's maybe a little hard to see, but you can see the different layers there. So on the far right, you can see the kind of super V profile, the outside skin that's shown in the picture below. And then there's this air gap, and then you can just barely see a very thin metal sheet there that's the aloe zinc radiant barrier. Then we've got the container wall itself, another thin layer of the aloe zinc as another radiant barrier, and then in this case we're using a plywood wall as the interior of the container. So unfortunately, I don't have the data yet. We will be collecting that to see how it performs. But based on the other projects that we've implemented this type of strategy, as well as the completely insulated boxes in our tests, we think that we're going to be able to block most of the heat from coming into the container here. There will be a roof. It's not shown here, but you can see some of the rafters there that are going on. So we will be obviously protecting the top of the container as well. So that's just some examples of how we're applying what we're learning through these tests. And yeah, as a quick summary, I think it's pretty intuitive to most of us that darker sheets result in higher temperature. It seems that darker colors are more fashionable. When I look around in Kampala, majority of roofs are dark red or black, generally tile. Another summary point, a single unpainted aloe zinc sheet performed the best out of all the single layer sheets, including white painted sheets. If the radiant barrier is right up against the top sheet, it performs not as well. If the top sheet is unpainted as well, like an unpainted aloe zinc sheet. Having the radiant barrier right up against it almost offered no benefit. It does offer a benefit if the top sheet is painted. And then we saw that if we put the radiant barrier with the air gap, both top and bottom, sort of in the middle of the roofing system, that's where we saw the best results. We saw that we could get much better results with a very, very thin radiant barrier, even compared to 50 millimeters of polystyrene insulation. We saw that the flat 32 gauge aloe zinc sheets perform almost as well as the more expensive imported bubble wrap and aluminum sheeting that we could get. And we saw that the unpainted ceiling does help minimize or reduce the amount of heat coming into the room. One thing I forgot to put in here, some of the downsides, going to an unpainted aloe zinc sheet, culturally, this is seen as cheap. And I think a lot of that, I can't say exactly what the history is there, but over the last, I think 5 years or so, at least in Uganda, I think maybe Kenya has been ahead on this, but the manufacturers have switched from just a straight galvanized product to this aluminum zinc product. And at least other places in the world, when they've done that, the aluminum zinc coating reduces the corrosion, the rust, much more than just the straight galvanized. So I think traditionally it's seen as the unpainted sheets are seen as cheap because they end up rusting and they don't look very good. And from a heat standpoint, then they start working terribly. The rusted corrugated or corroded surface absorbs and re-emits a lot of heat. But with the manufacturers changing their process and now using more of this aluminum zinc coating, if they're doing that right, the lifespan should be enhanced quite a bit, and it does actually help more so with the heat as well. But even so, one challenge that we've had with the aluminum zinc is if you store these outside and it rains and the water gets between the sheets while they're just being stored, it creates a lot of this black corrosion that gets hard to clean off. And even working on the roof, when people are working up on the roof, standing on it, it seems that they can often get, if you're not careful, these kind of black spots, not real dark, but it can kind of change the appearance. So that's probably one of the challenges that we've had with these aloe zinc roofs, and something that we're still trying to figure out how to best deal with. So anyway, that's my presentation. I'll sign off here.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel, for that great presentation. It's really interesting to see the experiments that you have done and also how some of these things have been implemented in real projects. So thank you. I guess now we have some time before the end of this seminar to ask questions, for people to ask their questions and to move on into a discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, and this is to the attendees, please raise your hand and then I will unmute you to talk, or you can continue to share in the question and answer box. As we start the process, I can ask, I guess, a few questions that we already have. The first, I guess, would be, there's kind of some materials, the questions about materials that have not yet been touched on. So the two of them are green roofs and also PV tile roofing. So I'm wondering if either of you would like to comment on these roofs, comment on whether they are suitable for the tropics, and your thoughts on those particular materials.
We haven't really used any of those. Yeah, there's always a million different types of tests or more materials that we could test, and eventually we'd like to do that. Even tile roofs, which are often used in Uganda anyway, but we haven't really done any test work on those yet.
Yeah, maybe Randy, these are two very different alternatives. The green roof is, of course, a tempting thought because a big layer of substrate or soil that will seriously reduce a lot of heat and noise impact on a steel roof or on a concrete roof, for that matter. The challenge that you will be facing is to keep your green roof green. Maybe you remember in the presentation I showed the roof in the Gogo area around Dodoma in Tanzania. They become basically green roofs. So in the wet season you see a beautiful green roof, but in the dry season every weed will perish, and then you risk the substrate to wash away. So if you want to keep a green roof green, you probably have to irrigate a green roof, or put really a very substantial layer of substrate on the roof, which will have as a consequence a heavy weight. In the northern countries, we would use drought resistant plants, and also plants that have not a tendency to increase the substrate amount and the humus buildup, because then you need a lot of maintenance to the roof. We call that sedum plants, but I've not done any research myself, but I doubt whether these will thrive under tropical conditions. So this is it's a beautiful challenge. I have not been involved in any of these experiments. I got a question a long time ago from Hamburg University, and I could refer back to them if they have done any research. The climate conditions in the highlands will be, of course, more favorable for green roofs than on the coastal or savanna area. The other proposed alternative, actually, I was thinking of bringing it up, even though I've got no experience whatsoever with it, but I think it's highly appealing, is the recently developed PV roof tile. It's a glass roof tile developed by Tesla. And I don't know, maybe Randy, you can just briefly share that little promo. It's just enticing, and maybe it's not yet feasible to use it in Africa, but I do think there is a lot of future in that.
Unmuted. I think should we go through a few of the other questions, and then maybe I can share the video, a promo video as well.
You're the boss.
If that's okay. So another question that we have that's come up quite often is about noise, and how what tests have been done, if any tests have been done, to control the level of noise, as that's a particular issue with metal roofs. So I think, yeah, some of the attendees are curious to know about what you think about this specific element.
Yeah, that's been a big concern for us as well. A lot of our projects are schools, and with these big tropical rains, it can make it impossible to teach from the front of the classroom. And then metal roofs, generally, what we use are probably the noisiest. And so we have done, I have some data on that. I can share maybe a little bit from our office. That was a concern in our office. A single Mabati sheet, even in the curved profile where it's really pretty rigid, we could measure up over 90 decibels in our office. When we added the radiant barrier and a second layer on top, we've got that down, and that was only in the center section. So the wings are still just a single sheet, so they're more noisy. But we've been able to reduce the noise to maybe low 80 decibels. So it's still really loud, but 10 decibel difference is, if you know anything about that scale, it's a logarithmic scale. And so 10 decibels is actually, to our ears, is about half the volume. So it's helped quite a bit. It unfortunately is still quite loud. And we've done some other tests. One thing that we've seen is that we do see a little bit better gains using the 32 gauge aluminum zinc radiant barrier compared to the bubble wrap type material. So it reduces the 32 gauge allo zinc actually reduces the noise coming through a little more. So that's encouraging. If you use just the corrugated roof sheets, so the ordinary corrugated, not the box section like a Super 5 profile, so just the sinusoidal profile on the top, that reduces the amount of noise quite a bit. If you think about it, the rain coming down, it's basically hitting the roof. It doesn't really have any flat surface of the roof to really hit. It's always hitting at an angle. And so the impact and the vibration that results is less. So we see quite a bit of reduction in the amount of noise by using the corrugated roofing sheet as the top roofing sheet compared to a more box section. So there's a few things like that. Yeah, I didn't include any slides on that data, but we have looked at it a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I can add to what you just said, Daniel. Is in our experience the more conventional solution of having a double roof, where the roof itself is just an ordinary steel roof sheet, corrugated roof sheet, and we have a flat ceiling underneath with airspace in between, and that flat ceiling is fairly easy to insulate with any material, with styropor, with rock wool. And then you can achieve substantial noise reduction in the room underneath, and still have good ventilation and heat reduction. But I've never measured it. But so far, I have very good experiences with that.
I'm just going to put Terry Thomas on to speak.
Hello? Hello?
Hello, hi, we can hear you.
You can hear me, yes. We want other properties as well as thermal properties, obviously. We would like something as rigid as possible. We'd like something you can walk on. There's also an issue of wildlife, of bats and insects in between the layers. And when we have a sandwich which is cooler, it's more likely that we'll get rather corrosive wildlife in between the barrier layer and the bottom of the ceiling layer, if you like. Has this been a problem at all? And it's also tied in a bit with ventilation, whether ventilating the space between the different layers is helpful, not so much from a wildlife point of view, but from a thermal point of view.
Well, if you allow me to answer that one, yes.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge. And we had to renovate the complete roof of Bukoba Cathedral on Lake Victoria because of the fact that a bat colony had settled itself there, and it made it impossible to hold a service in the church. So the protection of that airspace in between needs to be done with proper grills and meshes and so forth, which was still, you know, still risky. So yeah, it's a challenge, and but if properly detailed, you can avoid it.
Okay.
Yeah, so one way we've tried to look at this, when we do the sandwich systems, we make them quite thin. So generally the whole sandwich is less or about 100 mil thick. So the depth of, say, a common Z purlin. And then what we've often tried to do is fill in the gaps between the ridges and the ridges and the valleys of the roofing sheet. If we can get the pre-made filler foam blocks, we'll fill those all in so that the system's contained. So we don't get ventilation going through there, and that's what we did in our tests, our experiments, is we try to block all those gaps between the ridges and the valleys to see what happens if we don't have any ventilation. We've kind of gone back and forth on that, actually more from a condensation standpoint. But the other thing that becomes an issue is when we're using these radiant barriers, again, because it's a surface property that makes them work or not. One thing we've been concerned about is getting dust in on the radiant barrier. And if that radiant barrier gets coated with dust, now it loses the properties that are allowing it to work. So that's another reason. You probably can't completely get all the dust, but that's another reason we've tried to fill in those small gaps just to minimize just dust getting in there. So at least in our structures, it's been overall a pretty thin sandwich system. And yeah, we continue to monitor and see how it goes. But that's sort of the approach that we've taken.
Great, thank you for your question, Terry. Next, Leonard, I think I'll unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your questions.
Hello, hi. Hello to Antoni and Felix and Randy as well. It looks dark behind you. I suppose everyone's gone home. I had a couple of questions. One's been touched on already, which is to do with the double skin roof. I think a couple of Terry, Thomas, and also Antoni has mentioned this, and someone else, I think. But it's the equivalent of the trombe wall which is a ventilated cavity. And I admit that bats and other vermin is going to be a problem, but I'm sure that ventilating a cavity between the outer layer and the inner layer would have considerable benefits to keeping temperatures down. That was the first question, probably covered already. The other question is for Antoni. I don't think, Antoni, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but we've got very poor connection here, very poor internet. You didn't mention clay tile roofs. Now, that's a very common material throughout the world, and it's quite often used in Kampala as well. Did you mention it, or is it something that you didn't think was relevant?
I mentioned only in passing, Leonard. Good to see you, or not see you, but hear you. Yeah, it's of course a beautiful material, and you are so lucky in Kampala to have Kayansi. I don't know if they're still producing, but it's a material that has some consequences in terms of cost. It's not easy to be used in low cost projects like hospitals and affordable housing, and so because of the procurement of the material itself, that has to be imported in most of the cases, because of the relatively heaviness of the substructure. And then, of course, it also has a higher maintenance intensive quality. From an aesthetic point of view, of course, I love it too, and I've done quite a number of projects with it, but only in the higher market projects, not really for for the more public buildings or affordable housing. So yes, it's a good material. Its heat insulation is fairly moderate. It's not fantastic, but Daniel is here, the technical expert. I'm just talking from experience, and yeah, if you look at the buildings that were, for instance, erected by the East African railways, they're still standing, so they're durable. And I would be in favor of using them if they were produced in more widely produced in East Africa, and also if they were produced in a sustainable way, using renewable energy to fire them, and not firewood, for instance.
Thank you. Thanks, Antoni.
I will allow Clara to speak.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. The question I want to ask is, how would you compare the insulation performance of the triple alu zinc sheets and the more commonly used single sheet with a plaster and metal earth ceiling? Do they perform about the same, or is one better than the other, or does one become better mainly based on the cost difference? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think it'd be really interesting to see the data. Unfortunately, we haven't looked at it yet. It is something that we would like to explore more, because yeah, the last plastered ceilings are very common, and this is not, I don't have the data to support it, but just my personal experience in my home in Kampala, is a typical red clay tile roof and then plaster ceiling, and often it's fine, but when it's the warmer season, what we see or what we experience is that it gets uncomfortably hot in the evening. We end up having to shut all the windows and doors for bugs, and that's where as far as the amount of heat coming into the room is probably peak during the day. So the high thermal mass of the tiles and then the ceiling, they're basically absorbing this heat all through the day. They keep it cooler during the day, but then if you're using the building in the evening or at night, and you have to close up the windows and doors, I've found that it can get very uncomfortable inside, while it's extremely comfortable outside. And we have I don't have it available to show right now, but we have collected some data where we've used in a room that's had a plastered ceiling, and you can see the delayed peak comes in around 5, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night. So it basically absorbs the heat all during the day. That makes it comfortable during the day, but depending on how your building's used and the ventilation aspects that are there, if it all gets closed up, you basically have this hot ceiling that's just radiating down the heat in the evening. I found that it can get quite uncomfortable. That's not to say it's not a viable option. It's just something to be aware of, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Daniel, just maybe as a response to what you just said, I think one keyword that maybe we haven't talked so much about is allowing for nighttime cooling. In other words, to really allow these buildings to breathe also at night when it is cool outside, sort of to counter the effect that what you just mentioned. I wanted to ask a question to each of you. Antoni, how sort of on an anthropological level, this whole issue that was mentioned around metal roof sheets and silver roof sheets being by far the most efficient roof sheets, natural zinc R roof sheets, which are easily available here. This is of course something that we battle with every day, because we do a lot of schools and such things, and when you speak to the users, and ultimately you're trying to build buildings for the users, then, as it was mentioned during the presentation by Daniel, they perceive the plain colored silver roof sheet as a it's just sort of a poor man's roof. It evokes the idea of the rusty thing. You showed lots of pictures of Tanzanian roof landscapes that basically turn rust over time, which is also color-wise very beautiful, but of course heat-wise an absolute disaster, and also performance-wise a disaster. What's sort of your response to these issues? How do you deal with, if you want, the cultural side of this choice? So what role do you think an architect plays in this? And then Daniel, my question to you is, you have shown, I mean, generally one really interesting thing that I've learned today from you was that insulation in itself really doesn't do much. When you do this lightweight stuff, lightweight roofs or even lightweight facades, as you had shown, then really you can stick there rock wool or styrofoam or as Wang Sung, and interestingly, it actually doesn't help. It seems like it just heats up and just sits there. At least what your research seems to show is, we just need to make sure we reflect as much as we can. Then there was some discussion around air gaps and some interesting questions around that. You keep referring to a corrugated metal ceiling that you put at the bottom of your sandwich, and my question is really, how is this performing? I mean, apart from the look of it, which is going to be some sort of quite techie appearance, how is a corrugated sheet performing acoustically when it is the way you are using it? And would it not be smarter to use a ceiling that while softening, that can also deal with a noise issue? But maybe Antoni, you go first.
Okay, yeah. So I hear your question, and I wonder always when I travel and fly over an African city. Every year there is a new fashionable roof color, it seems. One year it's green, the next year it's purple, and the third year it's blue. And indeed, the normal unpainted sheet that turns brown after a while is a sign of poverty. And it is also a technical question I was actually having for Daniel, is that this alu sheet or this zinc sheet might have a great performance in year one, but what happens after 10 years? Is it still having better reflecting qualities as a colored sheet? So my favorite has always been a coated sheet. If money is available, a single span coated sheet in a light ecru, or what you call it, light gray color. I find that quite a chic appearance, and I've been able to convince quite a number of clients of this. But that's a rather personal taste, and it needs a personal persuasion. And I haven't published a paper on that to spread it wider. But it's an interesting point. And on the long term, we risk to lose the standard simple Mabati because of its this quality of seeing as a poor man's material, and that it will be replaced by something that is actually far less well performing on the long term. I can already see some fantastic fancy Chinese sheet conquering our markets. Some plastic stuff, or I don't know. You know, I'm maybe a little bit cynical here, but it's a difficult discussion, and we have been as European architects, we have been sort of fighting the Mabati for most of our careers, and now we are embracing it, and now it's starting to to become a poor man's material. So it seems like we're always running behind a bit on this sort of marketing exercise. That's a bit of my musings about your question. I don't know if this responsive, probably not, but it does highlight what challenges we are facing as architects in this respect.
Thanks for
that. Yeah, Felix, your question on the sound. I guess there's two sides to that. There's the sound that comes through the roof, and then there's the reflect or reverberation within a room. And I guess we've looked a little bit at just how that additional layer, how it reduces the noise coming through the roof, mostly looking at rain noise. We've used the corrugated roofs in classrooms, and yeah, as far as I know, that's not been once the classroom is filled with desks and chairs and everything like that, that there hasn't been a reverberation problem. I don't have specific data though to back it up. It's just more feedback from clients. And then Dr. Antoni, you asked about the longevity. Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. Because the markets have more recently changed, at least in Uganda, we just don't have that track record. So we're kind of looking at other places in the world where they have gone to this, instead of just a straight galvanized, they've gone to more of a aluminum zinc coating, trying to see how things have, how the life cycle in those areas, and that's been pretty good. So if these local manufacturers are doing the coating properly, I think that there should be minimal corrosion. That's their main selling point, is that it would last, up to 5 times longer, something like that. One other aspect with this, you definitely, I think, will see at least a reduced amount of reflection, just because dust settles on these roofs. And so it definitely reduces the amount that is reflected. However, like I mentioned earlier, we've tried to keep the inside of the system, trying to minimize the amount of dust that's getting in there, so that we can take advantage of the emissivity value. So the amount, even if the top sheet absorbs a lot of heat, that it won't emit very much if we can keep the underside properties at a low emissivity value. So, but yeah, time will tell. So it's something that we want to keep following up on and keep an eye on. But because the material is relatively new to the market, at least in Uganda, we don't necessarily have the track record yet. So it's a good question and something to keep watching.
Thank you. I think we will take one more question from Joseph Kigozi. I'll just unmute.
Sorry, that's just a typo. It was a typo. I didn't really raise the hand. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. That's fine. We did have a number of other questions. Maybe let me see. So I can ask one more question, I guess, about the light and the quality of light in spaces and how the roof, I guess it's more an architectural question directed towards Antoni Folkers, but yeah, the question here is about light reflections in buildings and generally how important the roof, overall the roof plays with light.
You want me to reflect on this, Randy?
Yeah, yes, please. Please do.
Sorry, can you just quickly repeat? I was a bit distracted, but it was about the light.
Yeah, it's about the quality of light in buildings and how important the roof is for this.
But within the building, you are looking at the ceiling, not looking at the roof. And the roof itself,
That's true.
you know, the shinier and the better. But for its environment, that can be a problem. You know, if you are sitting on the second floor of an adjoining building and you're looking on a brand new aluminium roof, then it's not really what you want to see. So. Inside, no, I don't really have anything. I don't really think I understand your question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We'll let the question. Sorry, I'll let one more question. I'll open up to Angela to ask a question, and then this will be our final question.
Good evening. I hope I can be heard. My questions are, my question is one, but sort of will break into three. I hope I can be heard because I can't hear Randy replying.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I would like to concentrate on what Claire brought up when she talked about the roofs that we're using so much, the ceiling, which is having the concrete that's being put for our ceiling, and whether that study has been done. But I also want to understand if there was anything put towards the eaves, because does, for example, the length of the eave affect the performance of the roof? Or is it mostly about how it is shaped and not whether it's shading the walls? Personally, my experience has been that when I raise the height of the walls, for example, the performance of the room is much better in terms of cooling, regardless of the heat outside. And I've also found out that separating the ventilation from the windows, as commonly used now, you know, we have a trend where the windows and the ventilation has been combined. I find that when that's separated, also the performance of the room is much better. Is this something that Antoni or Brian has looked into to see that it can make the rooms much better in relation to their roofs?
Angela, you are referring to roof eaves and the depth of the roof eaves. Is that what I understand? Roof overhang?
Yes.
Cantilever? Yes. Yeah, you know, that is such an obvious thing that I apologize for not having mentioned it, but the deeper the eave, the better the performance and the most of East African climates. And when you talk about storied buildings, then you're also soon into thinking of building window canopies or partial roofs over windows to you know, to reduce sun impact and shading, and also avoid rain impact sometimes. It's again technically speaking, it's easy. It's for the architect. It's a great way of improving the microclimate in the building through passive design. But unfortunately, it sometimes conflicts with certain aesthetical or other wishes from clients who want to have a full glazed facade or something like that. It's often being sacrificed in the face of fashion or another way of representation, where sometimes, funny enough, in my eyes, it becomes less important than that, and that you have in many African cities. There are now tall glass skyscrapers, and I wonder about the air conditioning bill in those buildings, if there's any power at all. But it's this conflict that you soon come into as a designer. I think that most of the people here in the room, if I may call it like that, will have this kind of challenges often enough.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Again, it's not something that we've specifically tested yet. Yeah, I completely agree. From a technical standpoint, the more that you can shade a building, the less it allows the walls to heat up and store that heat, or radiate it back inside the building. So longer eaves, bigger overhangs just help shade the building more. Basically, the more mass that you have, so if you've got a concrete or brick wall or a concrete or plastered ceiling, you've got a lot more mass there. So it's just going to take longer for that heat basically to move through. So as the heat absorbs, the temperature will slowly increase. So it delays basically the transfer of heat, if you want to think of it that way. So again, depending on how you're using the building, if you're primarily using it during the day, then it can be a good strategy to minimize the heat felt inside the building. Again, my experience has been, and I've seen some data that we've collected that supports this as well, but if you're using the building in the evening or at night, peak temperatures inside can be around the evening hours. And so if you're closing up everything to keep out the bugs and things like that, then that can be a challenge. So it gets, I think, to your point of the separation between the windows and some of the ventilation, other screen ventilation, what Felix was talking about as well, night flushing, things like that. But I would just say that, besides the ventilation, the surface temperatures that are around you, so the ceiling, the walls, those all come to play. It's not just the temperature of the air. So if your walls have been sitting in the sun all day, and now the inside surface temperature of your wall and your ceiling are all elevated, say they're all like 35 degrees, it's going to feel uncomfortable. So besides just ventilation, trying to think, how can we keep the temperature of these large surfaces, keep those temperatures down? That impacts the comfort of a room significantly. So it's just another pretty important side of thinking about how we design these buildings.
Thank you very much.
Great. I think we will conclude our event for today. Thank you so much for all the questions that you have asked as the attendees. There are many questions left to be answered, and a few of you still have your hands up to ask questions. So thank you for engaging with the speakers and with this topic generally. We'd love you to share your questions via email that can be answered later if it's urgent, not urgent, but yes, please do share your questions as we continue the conversation. I guess the idea of Local Talks is that it doesn't just end here, but that we continue to share and discuss all these topics. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. Please do follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. And we also have a YouTube channel where this talk will be uploaded. There's a number of you have asked about where you can get copies of Antoni's book and also Daniel's research, whether it's available. So we will also share more information about these two items. But for now, thank you. And also in the future, if you do have any topics that you think are interesting that Local Talks could share on, or if you know people with particular expertise in the area of green design, please do feel free to contact us and share this. We'd love to have as many of you involved as possible in these events. Yeah, have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you next. The next session will be in 3 months and on the 3rd Wednesday. So Local Talks is always on third Wednesday of the month. So we look forward to seeing you there, and we hope that you have learned something. And yeah, good night. Bye.